Hello, hello, everybody. Be very welcome here, whoever you are, wherever you are. Be very welcome. I'm very glad to be here with you. My name is Benoit Le Bouteiller. I'm psychoanalyst, and I'm the director of the IIP, the International Institute of Psychoanalysis. Uh, Very glad to be here with you. Many people from many places in this world. I'm talking from Porto das Dunas. It's very near Fortaleza, which is the capital of a state called Ceará in Brazil. And I think there's people from all over the world today for this new IIP Talks. We'll have the pleasure to listen to our dear friend, colleague, Jed Wilson. In a few moments, I will give the floor for our dear Jed. Just before this, I have to remember I'm going to give a few informations about me for blind people. I'm white and I have a short, almost white beard and mustache, and I have a very short, almost shaved hair, and I have a T-shirt. I don't know how to say the color, caramel colored T-shirt. And behind me there is how can we call this, a wall of Portuguese style mosaics. Yeah, mostly blue. Yeah. um, just now, before giving the floor to our dear Jed, I would like to welcome Adeline. Hi, Adeline. Adeline, you are one of the executive assistants of the IIP, and you wanted to talk about us. You wanted to talk about our two one-year formations.
Correct. Yes. Hi, everyone. So my name is Adeline Calabert, and as Benoit said, I'm part of the executive assistant team. I'm a white cis woman with brown hair in a ponytail and brown eyes, and I have large red earrings and a black t-shirt. So, and also, I apologize for my English, which isn't my mother tongue. But let's go. I'd like to talk to you about the two formations offered by the IIP. Both of them are going to start in September. And I believe that the last day to register is on September 8th. So we have two formations. The first one is called Foundations for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. It's mostly for people who are new to psychoanalysis, but not only, it's also for people who would like maybe a fresh start, a fresh new start in psychoanalysis, or would like to maybe rethink about some concepts or maybe some dogma. I'm going to share my screen in a little while. And the other formation is called Techniques for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. And it's for people who already have clinical practice, right? So I'm going to share very quickly. My screen, hopefully it works. Okay. Oh, no, sorry. I'm gonna start again here. Okay, can you see my screen? Is it okay? Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So this is the first formation I was telling you about. I'm going to go very quickly through it. So the title, as I said, is Foundations for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. So that's for people who would like either to set a foot in the foundations or maybe rethink about the foundations. As I said, the registrations are open until September 8th. It's 100% online formation. and it's a 1-year formation from September to August next year. If you'd like to register, it's pretty simple. It's completely free to do the pre-registration. You just click on the button here, and you have, I think, a very short form that we will receive, and we'll get back to you by email. My colleagues are going to get back to you, Carol, who's here, or Dorothée. And if you'd like also, you can just pop a quick question or even ask for more information on the WhatsApp button. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. Yes, great. So for this formation, we have a lot of very interesting professors from all over the world. We have people from Brazil, from France, from Turkey, from Japan, from France, I'm not sure. We do have a class with Jed Butler from Morocco. We do also have a class with Jed, who is here today. Thank you, Jed. And I'm going to show you very quickly the program so that you have an idea what we're talking about. We have a class on history of psychoanalysis, which is, we have some classes that are recorded, and we also have live discussion classes about the recordings. So it will be with Fabrice Bourles, who is a professor from France and Belgium. We talk about the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. So it's the same way. Some classes are recorded, but we have the live discussion classes also with Fabrice and with Monica, who is from Brazil. We have a class on Freud and some very important texts of his with Laurie Lofet, Judith Butler, and I believe Danny Nobus is yet to be confirmed. Benoit is going to talk about the opening of Lacan's first seminars, the very first sentence, and is going to elaborate something about from that very first sentence. We have a class on psychoanalysis in the contemporary world, where we focus on something a little bit different, decolonizing and very freeing classes, I believe. We have classes about races and gender, the post-human jouissance with Fabrice. We have classes on the autism spectrum. We also have classes on the psychic structures, on construction of clinical case, how we can start to construct clinical cases. So we're going to talk about theory, but also we're going to listen to clinical cases. And finally, we have a time to listen session where students can give a feedback or ask questions or anything that they want about what happened in the last 2 months. So this is for the foundations class, formation. And the second one is techniques for contemporary clinic. So the registrations are on the same mode. They also go until September 8th. It's the same way to pre-register. You can click on the button and talk to us, fill the form. We're going to get back to you. And you can also start to ask questions or ask for more info here on the WhatsApp button. We have professors also from the whole world, from very different perspectives and from very different backgrounds. And about the program, let me show you. So we'll have an introduction class, will be live. We'll have supervision classes. So the supervision classes are going to be split into language groups. There will be an English-speaking supervision class, a French-speaking supervision class, and a Portuguese-speaking supervision class, each with a professor, and they're going to be groups. And we also have research on psychoanalysis theory. It will be, I believe, the same way, 3 groups for it, 1 group for each language. We have Lacan, Back to the Future, which sounds very exciting. And Jed will be one of the professors for this class, right, Jed? Uh, oh, then we'll have the construction of clinical case, which will be joined to the other formation. So students get to know each other and have a class in common, which is really nice. We have a class on psychoanalytic techniques, whose teacher is Jed Wilson, which is great. We have the whole schedule here if you'd like to take a quick look. And note that all the classes, all the disciplines for this formation, they're all live classes. Then we have the opening of Lacan's last seminars. In the other formation, it's the first seminars, and this one is the last seminars given by Benoit. So I think Carol sent the link in the chat if you'd like to have a look with a little bit more calm and a little bit less pressure. Please do so. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask us. You can send us an email, you can send us messages on WhatsApp, and we'll be very happy to answer your questions and give you more information. Thank you. Benoit, the floor is yours again.
Wow, Adeline, thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so now it's time for us to call our dear Jed Wilson. Jed, the floor is yours. Please tell us, who are you? Where are you? And you're here in your house in the IIP, so feel very well at home, please.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Benoit and Adeline and Carolina and everyone involved with putting this together. Thank you to the IIP for its hospitality, welcoming me into the house, as is your way. Pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm Jed Wilson. I'm a psychoanalyst in private practice. I'm here in Maine, in the northeastern part of the United States, where I live and work. I will, as an act of hospitality for our friends who might have a visual impairment, give a brief audio description of myself. I'm a white cis man with brown hair and a formerly brown but now quite white or whiter everyday beard, clear glasses, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. Unfortunately, the same blue shirt I was wearing in the promo materials. I got to make sure not to do that again. And behind me is a shoji screen that sits in my home office here. So, yeah, I'm really enjoying the provocative opportunity, I guess we might say, to have prepared something for the IIP Talks. In this case, I decided to take up the theme of time and our experience of time in our contemporary historical moment. I did so more or less on a whim, on a hunch that there was something there, and it's sort of like, I think Bion says somewhere that sometimes you make a concept and it's like a little nest and you don't know which birds are going to come and alight in the nest. And it was a bit like this. I thought, okay, I have this idea of a time of collapse and a collapse of time. Let's see what is generated. As you might have already worked out, I stumbled upon this in part through looking at the work of Paolo Aranci's in his book, The New Time of the World. And then I began to write, and here I have this little text I will read to you. It's definitely a work in progress. I don't mean to in any way suggest this is a definitive word on the matter. I'm not here to wow you, although I don't want to lull you to sleep either, but I want to hopefully invite a conversation about these matters, which affects our politics, our culture, and our clinical experience as well. So I will read, and I'm going to try to not move so slowly that we don't have ample time to speak together. I'm very curious to hear what this might stir in you. So hopefully we can have a dialogue that is quite expansive. So without further ado, this is Time of Collapse, Collapse of Time. Coming of age at the end of the last century, I was a child of what they called the end of history. This strange, almost manic pronouncement of Francis Fukuyama proposed not that the movement of time had literally ceased, but that the dialectic of political upheaval and ideological evolution had finally reached its logical conclusion. We'd finally all made the crossing and had landed together at the secure shore of neoliberal governance. Or if we hadn't made it yet, we were about to arrive any day now. A utopic landscape of forever, of unbridled growth and prosperity beckoned us all. Remember how the end of history ended? Fukuyama's thesis was almost dead on arrival. The Berlin Wall fell, but in short order, the war on terror replaced the Cold War. There emerged a new enemy, new contradictions. The end was over, and we were back in a more familiar temporality, vanquishing obstacles en route to that same future of shining potential, but now deferred, tantalizingly receding into the horizon. Historical time was reawakened, resumed a more conventional rhythm, a decipherable dialectic. What now then, nearly a quarter century after 9/11, after the Great Recession, after the cataclysm of Trump, not to mention Bolsonaro, Maloney, others, now that we cannot deny the insidious spread of a neo-fascist plague, after the even more literal plague of COVID-19, after the social mediaization of the fragile vestiges of the commons, after the algorithmic hijacking of the brain, or why not the drive, after the partitioning of discourse into completely disjunctive epistemic universes? What now when we grow accustomed to checking the air quality index before going outside, when, after returning home from the festival, a night of music and dancing outdoors, we feel the residues of the Saskatchewan wildfires thousands of miles away in our noses and in our throats, when LA burns and the majority of the western United States is under drought, while flash floods kill dozens in Texas, hurricanes of unheard of proportions attack the Atlantic coastline. As our scrolling feed toggles between collapses of all manner of systems, social, political, ecological, what will become of us? What becomes of the future? I've seen the future, sang Leonard Cohen. It is murder. Things are going to slide in all directions. Won't be nothing you can measure anymore. Sliding in all directions indeed, slidings of patterns, of seasons, slidings of all cycles of recurrence. Alongside the actual landslides, our existential ground gives way. The foundations of our very being are frightfully shifting, a daily confrontation with the unprecedented and the unpredictable. We all live in the entropics now. A little joke, entropy, tropics, you get it. There is a paradox at work in this. We experience simultaneously the encroaching of a dread-inducing sense of impossibility, and strangely, we are threatened by a wild expansion of what is possible. As we are haunted by the sense that a future of promise and potential is foreclosed, nevertheless, this beleaguered, claustrophobic present in which we dwell, this hypoxic, almost futureless world, confronts us daily with grotesque novelties, forms of crisis and catastrophe that were hitherto unimaginable. All the more so, this monstrous present wrests from us the stabilizing refrains that we had taken for granted, the configurations and relationships that had quietly operated in the subjective surround, a kind of infrastructure or backdrop for the shaping of life worlds. Much more than when he originally articulated the notion, we are dwelling in Paolo Aranci's timeless time of perpetual urgency. Time is out of joint, says Hamlet, following a thesis of Koselleck, Aranches observes that the subjective living of time in any historical era can be framed by the relation between the space of experience and the horizon of expectation. Modernity, according to this view, inaugurated an unprecedented distance between these two domains. That is to say, the modern subject was uniquely imbued with the perception that the future would diverge greatly from the present, that progress would inexorably transform all facets of civilization toward something better. The future, in such a subjectivization of history, is open, but not threateningly so. For the quintessential modern subject, the future was a horizon of possibility domesticated by certain teleological presumptions. Remember how often we are being comforted by the so-called arc of history that bends towards justice, or whatever ideal you might want to insert here. By the same token, this horizon of expectation for the modern subject required a certain stability with regard to forms of impossibility. The confidence in the notion of infinite economic growth, the certainty that a steady unfolding of technological innovations would produce only manageable disruptions, and on balance increase our quality of life, our access to convenience and comfort. The cocksureness that in time all the nations of the world would arrive at the shore of the Fukuyaman end of history, where capital accumulation operating in tandem with parliamentary democracy would walk us all into the halcyon realm of perpetual peace. These expectations, turned axiomatic certainties, were undergirded by a kind of zealous faith in certain conditions of impossibility. The crises wouldn't be too frequent or too intense. The hegemony of the neoliberal world order might be challenged, but wouldn't ever be under existential threat. The earth itself would never stop holding up its part of the deal, would never cease reiterating endlessly its reliable cadences, and offering itself like a lamb to the slaughter for unlimited extraction and exploitation. Of course, these things would never happen. Already in the last century, there were signs that the fabric of this tranquilizing illusion was beginning to fray and come undone. Aranches describes a trend well before the contemporary cavalcade of upheavals I alluded to a moment ago, of diminishing hopes, as if the distance between the space of experience and the horizon of expectation had reached its zenith and the future had begun to recoil. This strange retraction of the future as a domain of promise cannot be thought of as a return to a pre-modern historical sensibility, in which the future will once again hew closely to the present as its continuity. No, we can't go home again, but twice over. Not to our more recent futurity of yet unimaginable shining possibility, and even less so to the anterior arrangement, futurity as stable perpetuation of the rhythms of the present. Here, as in so many situations, nostalgia is little more than a seductive ruse. The future of our time, the timeless time of perpetual urgency, is a futurity of looming ultimate disaster which hovers, unrealized, and yet emanating into the present, a proliferation of evanescent crises. In this sense, time both takes on a rapidity, a wild increase in tempo, but simultaneously goes nowhere, like an engine with tremendous horsepower that can only idle. The catastrophe then is never quite arrived and simultaneously, paradoxically, already is. We continue to anticipate, attempt to attenuate, and perhaps even imagine magical deliverance from the worst effects of climate change. This is the looming. While we already live with its impacts on a daily basis, this is its emanation into the present from its hovering in the undead space of our broken futurity. The catastrophe in its contemporary mode bears a structure most adequately described by Timothy Morton in their notion of the hyperobject. These are non-local objects whose effects are dispersed across vast spaces and times, but whose repercussions are visited upon us intimately and constantly as a result of what Morton calls their profound viscosity. Hyperobjects, everywhere and nowhere, stick to you, get inside you. It's the way that climate change doesn't have a discrete location or time, hovers above and alongside almost everything we experience without being definitively situated anywhere in particular, yet viscerally immediate in the storm that suddenly exceeds expectations and puts one's home and body at risk. It's how you wake up in Maine with Saskatchewan wildfire smoke in your lungs. It's how the algorithmic logic of the contemporary internet is dispersed along a network of uncountably many servers, data centers, operating systems, not to speak of the minds of engineers, designers, CEOs, and shareholders, venture capitalists. And yet it's in the nooks and crannies of your very subjectivity as you doom scroll or watch another reel or exclaim that you can't go a day without completing the Wordle. Everywhere, nowhere in particular, and inside you, inside us, insidious. I think we could say fascism itself is a hyperobject. Politically speaking, it has conquered specific geographical localities, to be sure, but more expansively, it manifests itself as a set of forces quite diffuse, dispersed. As it makes strides in parliaments and wrests control of governments, it equally insinuates itself into the virtual territories of online discourse, and more radically into our very beings as a set of micro-fascist sensibilities. Fascism is perhaps the politics that most easily comports itself with the timeless time of perpetual urgency. As Deleuze and Guattari remind us, what distinguishes totalitarianism from fascism is precisely the latter's suicidality. Totalitarian states have a will to endure, and therefore align with a futurity of perpetuation or possibility. Fascism, by contrast, is insatiable and needs more even than the totalization of its authority. It must go beyond the limit, beyond, we might say, the pleasure principle. It is fascism's kernel of self-destruction, its zeal for the suicidal spectacle, that makes for its morbid marriage with our monstrous temporality. However awash in promises of future prosperity fascism appears to be, note that the coming golden age is always painted in nostalgic tones. It's Make America Great Again, suicidal nostalgia, the political style of our moment. Though fascism in general revels in spectacle, here we might want to remember Benjamin's thesis of its aestheticization of politics. The particular Trumpian spin on the old theme is the frenetic tempo at which he propagates new spectacular events, and the rapidity with which they are forgotten. In the timeless time of perpetual urgency, inhabited virtuosically by Trump, no particular object of urgency persists for long. How apropos that the strategy is referred to by a metaphor of natural disaster, flooding the zone, it is called. In this constant overflow of calamity and obscenity, every discrete event is rendered perfectly ephemeral. The way that Trumpian time is out of joint is that it populates the present with 1,000 crises that defy the compactification of narrative coherence and historicization. The anticipation of the one crisis to end them all continues to loom, as in, when will he eventually drop a nuclear bomb, but continuously deferred. Meanwhile, a teeming infinity of smaller shocks greet us each day as we grip and clench and fidget, lost in the idling unto nowhere. Could we say that we are living in an everlasting penultimacy, an arrested waiting for the big one? Here we all are in the voice of Clove from Beckett's Endgame. Finished, it's finished, nearly finished. It must be nearly finished. Our situation could also be likened to the key players in Lars von Trier's 2011 film Melancholia. Confronted with the approach of a rogue planet speeding toward Earth, a planet, it should be said, that bears the name Melancholia, each of the film's central figures grapples with the crisis in their own particular style. First, of course, there is Justine, who is in the throes of a depression that appears melancholic indeed, sometimes immobilized to the point of catatonia. Justine voices an unflinching certainty about the inevitability of the cataclysm, and in fact appears to embrace it, most notably in the enigmatic gesture of shedding her clothing in the forest and literally basking in the glow of that which will bring the destruction of all life. Then we have her brother-in-law, John, the inveterate rationalist, who takes refuge in the predictions of the scientists who have concluded that planet Melancholia will miss the Earth, amounting to a flyby, and therefore something of a boon for stargazers like himself. As John excitedly tinkers with his telescopes and prepares for the extraordinary spectacle to come, he exudes the confidence of the devout positivist, one who believes science to be not only objective, but crucially complete, a system without any troubling areas of insoluble indeterminacy. John initially presents as a natural foil for the character of Justine, his position being diametrically opposed to hers. He is, after all, just as sure of the existence of a future as Justine is sure of the future's imminent foreclosure. But it is the sureness itself that they have in common. Each in their way exhibits a kind of epistemic zealotry. John's positivism, perhaps more scientistic than it is scientific, proves remarkably brittle and unable to accommodate the irreducibility of the gap, the lacuna, in Lacanian terms, the real. In what for me might be the pivotal shot in the film, we witness the vertiginous moment in which John is confronted with the lack in the big other. The sudden, overwhelming realization that melancholia, after appearing to pass by as predicted, is again encroaching, that the impossible has morphed into the inevitable, that, to paraphrase Hamlet again, there is more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in John's philosophy. It is the first time we see him look up to the sky in humility, and yes, terror. Prior to this scene, every time John looks up, it is not the wonder before the infinite that we see in his face. Rather, it is the cool satisfaction of the one who beholds a clockwork universe functioning with a lawful docility, the entirely intelligible, obedient universe. We could say that John might represent all of the seductive strategies of denial that are currently on offer. The quintessential contemporary examples perhaps being techno-utopianism and a credulous faith in institutions. As the conflagration of crises intensifies, the tech bros blithely reassure us that AI and geoengineering will rectify any problems that we will encounter. As Mark Andreessen has claimed, quote, there is no material problem that cannot be solved with more technology. Meanwhile, as jackbooted and masked ICE agents terrorize U.S. cities, detaining, deporting, and disappearing people indiscriminately, menacingly, without due process, the centrist Democrats would appear to be trying to rock us to sleep by singing lullabies about the resiliency of our democracy, the readiness of its restoration. Neither the techno-optimists nor the institutional fetishists have yet looked up and seen that melancholia is perhaps not retreating after all. They either deny the brokenness of the clock or soothingly affirm that it can readily be repaired. What of Justine, then, who ultimately proves correct? The one who refuses all reassurances. Is hers a position we can use as a basis for confronting our own looming cataclysm? At first blush, there does seem to be a liberatory potential in Justine's disposition, particularly with respect to the fact that she can at least entertain the possibility of the planetary collision, where for John it is a priori unthinkable. She does not cling to any story, scientific or otherwise, that would shelter her from the devastating prospect of extinction. But this is where the emancipatory dimension of Justine's position ends. For Justine, the disaster cannot be sustained as possible or contingent. It is enshrined in the place of absolute necessity. For her, it must be, just as powerfully as for John, it must not be. It is in the handling of Justine's conviction about the impending catastrophe that the film is both so eloquent about melancholia as a psychical phenomenon and simultaneously bears its most symptomatic mark as an artwork. We come to understand quickly that Justine's certainty about the lack of a future is born of a powerful affinity with nothingness, with the void. For her, life itself, life as such, is irredeemable. She is, as it were, in love with extinction. But we would make a crucial error if we understood the void to which Justine is devoted to be the void of the unknown or the unknowable. On the contrary, Justine knows, and she knows absolutely, with a certitude that crosses into the uncanny. This results in a moment where, in my reading anyway, we feel von Trier slip, and his own identification with the character Justine results in a symptomatic blurring, a spilling over of the logic of Justine's melancholia into the logic of the narrative itself. The moment I have in mind is when Justine reveals that she has correctly guessed, or should we say intuited, the exact number of beans in the glass container at her wedding, 678. In interviews, von Trier has pointed to this event as a kind of proof of Justine's special gifts, a way that her paralyzing depression has paradoxically rendered her closer to the real. But this is precisely the misstep in the film, from my point of view. By granting Justine clairvoyant powers, von Trier misses an opportunity to depict the melancholic relation to the future. He ends up producing something else, a portrait of a morbidly depressed seer. The more subtle move might have been to show us Justine's profound conviction while demonstrating that she has no more special access to the real of the future than does John. This would allow Justine to emerge more clearly as a non-magical being who embodies what I would prefer to characterize as a nihilism not yet carried to its completion. On this point, I refer to Peter Paul Pelbart's Cartography of Exhaustion, where he highlights that nihilism in Nietzsche is equivocal. As he says, quote, on the one hand, it is a symptom of decadence and aversion to existence, and at the same time, on the other hand, it is an expression of increased force, a condition for a new beginning, perhaps even a promise. With Pelbart's roadmap to Nietzsche in hand, we could say that the passage from John to Justine represents a necessary first step, but that there is the real risk of getting waylaid in the negative and passive forms of nihilism that represent only its destructive potentialities. We have to pass further, effectuating what Pelbart refers to as the crossing of nihilism, into a destructiveness of another order, a force that creates as it destroys, something that comes into being in nihilism's more active and affirmative dimensions. Beyond the position of John, for whom extinction is logically impossible, beyond the position of Justine, for whom extinction is logically necessary. It is only the figure of Claire, torn between Justine, her sister, and John, her husband, above all dedicated to the care of her son Leo. Only Claire who embodies something of the position of contingency and possibility, from which we would begin to reopen the future, construct anew our sober but tenacious hopes. There's a moment I would quote when Justine says, "The earth is evil. We don't need to grieve for it." And Claire's response, "But where will Leo grow up?" For us to break out of the tyranny of this timeless time of perpetual urgency, we must risk a more adventurous experimentalism with time itself. In the same work cited above, Pelbart provides a rich taxonomy of temporalities in the work of Deleuze and Guattari. In this expanded field of temporal becomings, the fact that time is out of joint proves to be not merely a vertiginous disorientation, but equally a generative provocation. The impetus to fashion a, quote, concept of time belonging to thought as creation, and to, quote, think of a time in agreement with the force of the new. He demonstrates that for Deleuze and Guattari, there is a rhizomatic time of becomings that is not reducible to historicization. For Pelbart, this means, quote, reinventing the conditions for the invention of other times which are not those already consecrated by history. I think of Jordan, an analysand and activist on the front lines of the struggle for LGBTQ rights, who speaks of the challenge of how to be in relation to what they call the horror, a childhood memory in school, learning for the first time about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, sobbing in the classroom, having to excuse themselves. Another time it was the melting of the polar ice caps. They would be sleepless, inconsolable, nothing their parents could say. The dawning of Jordan's confrontation with horrors past and future, the looming and the emanating of the catastrophe, the evaporating of the future. Years spent avoiding the recognition of it, but it was already inside them. Eventually, something bursts open, Now it is always, all the time, everywhere, the horror. Can we construct a filter, a veil? We wonder. Jordan says, it never made sense to me when people said you should live each day as if it were your last. So I set out to live each day as if it were my first. A temporary solution to the problem of the future. But are there any other kinds? We work with what we can for as long as it works. But now fascism is no longer just at the door. It is in the house. Everywhere the horror. Or is it so? It's not everything everywhere all the time, we decide. A need to compactify, to contain. Not an illusion, a more incisive view. Jordan builds new timescales, studying queer history into the far reaches of the past. There are rhythms of resistance woven into the fabric of this subversive history that they read and write and embody. Things can return. We have always been here, they say. The temporality goes just as far into the future, working not for tomorrow, not for next year, working for 100 years from now, working for ones you'll never know, working for the insistent possibility of a more emancipated people. I think of Aidan, who sees a world inflamed. The inflammation is in the atmosphere, and it's in us. But at an ultimate level, Aidan beholds the pixels, a vagabond disorganization of intensive events, before and beneath identity and thought. He writes, and he tries to write from that register, doing what words can only faintly do. Everywhere, though, even in the ones he loves, things get too organized and lose their pixelation. As we buy in, as we sell out, we organize ourselves and we become inflamed. It stirs him to anger, and he wants to yell, stop. Stop colluding. He says, there was a beautiful lot of trees taken down to put in another storage space in the 95-degree heat. He says, it doesn't have to be like this, but we would have to do things differently. Aidan can plunge into pixelated time, outside of convention, subtending the inflamed organizing of it all. He unhooks, he unlearns the names and produces wayward times of reverie and explosion. It's a wild temporality, desubjectivized, staring into the intricacies, becoming seeing. I should be more joyful and less cynical, he says. Cynical feels fixed. How to bring into the field of the inflammation, the cry on behalf of the disorganized wildness. Aidan plays with velocities, tempos, including a radical slowness. He befriends stones. He goes elemental. From reverie to explosion again, from seeing a tree without seeing a tree to yelling stop, combating capture, constructing militant temporalities of resistance to the routinization, the fixity, the organization of time itself, which wants to be in pixels or suspended in the face of the rock. The modulations of temporality are going to be manifold. Some will perhaps have to dream intensively of a future without human subjectivity, taking the question of extinction to its limit and letting its implications spill backwards into the living of the present. The subjectless future finds its counterpart in futureless subjectivity, forms of living that radically avow the impossibility of any escape. But not only this, we can witness the arisal of nascent futures that tunnel their way through the catastrophe and open out into other landscapes that will have to be outfitted with unprecedented visions of what a more inhabitable world could feel like. The route through and where it leads, this expansive landscape of virtualities, might each be sites of temporal variation, of future making, and path shaping. The resources are rhythm, refrain, modulations of tempo. A politics and a clinic of the rewilding of time will have to be musical. The palette of rhythmic possibilities can expand only to the degree that we decipher the mystifying temporal code of our timeless time and its manic urgency. Permacrisis has the semblance of an untethering, an atemporality, but in fact, beneath this facade, we can discern the all too familiar rhythms of capital accumulation, operating with a frightful insistence. After all, fascism, even at its most entropic moments, remains the handmaiden of capital. Here we should recall Marx's many meditations upon temporality in the capitalist mode of production, chiefly the way that time is brutally rendered abstract and quantifiable in order to maximize the production of surplus value. On a Bergsonian note, we could say that time, most essentially a qualitative heterogeneous multiplicity, is always vulnerable to certain cognitive processes of quantification and homogenization. Capital then capitalizes on this human, all too human tendency, fixing and crystallizing time, subjecting our living of time to a devastating metric regularity, alienating us from the essential creativity and spontaneity of qualitative time as pure duration. Experimentation with time, undoing of metric crystallizations, is thus an act of subversion, of resistance, of disalienation. We would be remiss, however, if we conceived of this as an operation to be undertaken by an isolated subject. Rather, we must confront this question not only in our individual singularity, but crucially in community, in the friction and the heat and the risk of encounter, dialogue, the construction of new collectivities. Wild temporality is not only as private chambers of subjective exploration, but collaborative creations of yet unimagined worlds and ways of inhabiting time together. On this score, I give the last word to Deleuze in response to a question from Antonio Negri. In this particular moment of dialogue, Deleuze is speaking of the ways that individuals and groups constitute themselves as subjects through processes of subjectification. Notice here that we are already expanding the sense of subjectivity beyond a solitary Cartesian interiority. Quote, "What counts in such processes is the extent to which, as they take shape, they elude both established forms of knowledge and the dominant forms of power. Even if they in turn engender new forms of power or become assimilated into new forms of knowledge, for a while, though, they have a real rebellious spontaneity. This has nothing to do with going back to the subject, that is, something invested with duties, power, and knowledge. One might equally well speak of new kinds of event, rather than processes of subjectification. Events that can't be explained by the situations that give rise to them, or into which they lead. They appear for a moment, and it's that moment that matters. It's the chance we must seize." He goes on to say, what we most lack is a belief in the world. We've quite lost the world. It's been taken from us. If you believe in the world, you precipitate events, however inconspicuous, that elude control. You engender new space-times, however small their surface or volume. Our ability to resist control or our submission to it has to be assessed at the level of our every move. We need both creativity and a people, end quote. In a humble way, then, echoing Deleuze, I'm inviting us as clinicians, yes, but much more so as citizens constituting a people yet to come, a people always becoming, to consider anew where are the avenues for rebellious rhythms and movements that might reconfigure a collective field of time that is currently dominated by the hypnotic urgencies that mystify us and perpetuate our alienation. That's all. Thank you.
Wow, Jed. Jed, thank you so much. Thank you so much to share with us this work. A very rich and precious work. And for my part, I heard in a refreshing way the deep and dynamical connection between the clinical, the political, and the aesthetical dimensions. Whoever wants to ask questions, make any comments, the floor is yours. If someone feels more comfortable to write a question or a comment, of course it's possible in the chat. Anyone who wants to open the mic is very welcome.
And you need not have a perfectly formulated thought. You can bring a fragment, a free association, whatever you like. Seth.
Oh, Seth, be very welcome, Seth.
Thank you, Jed. This was really great. I have a association to offer, and then also a loose formulation of a question. Um, my dad's a wildlife biologist for the state of Montana in the Northwest, and as you were talking about fires, it sort of provoked this thing in me about this sort of omni crisis with the fires in Southern California where I live last year, and then the fires up in Canada. And I took a long road trip with him across the state last year, and we were talking with other wildlife biologists in the state, and apparently we have fires up in Canada now that once they start, they basically just burn until the snow comes. They don't. There's no putting them out. And I know that in the Malibu area where the big Palisades fire was last year, what's his name? There's a very famous Southern California historian who wrote it's in a book called Ecologies of Fear, where he talks about how physicists study Southern California wildfires because of the intensity of the heat and the combustion of them is the closest thing that we can get to like nuclear wildfires. And so they study the dynamics of these in order to anticipate and sort of do scientific research on this stuff. Um, and then my question then also is to put it in the shape of a joke. It's interesting. Did Deleuze ever write anything about Lars von Trier? I mean, they weren't. They were contemporaneous for a little bit before he died, but I don't know how. I don't know the filmmakers Oeuvre that much, but like, there's something about like the repetition of all these different crises. And I wonder what he would have maybe had to say about some of that. And it's interesting to see him being taken up in psychoanalysis today in ways that I think are really productive, because he really hated psychoanalysis in some capacities, especially later on. And then like I know that there's a lot of people on the Lacanian side of things that have a lot of animosity towards Deleuze, and there's some interesting criticisms of him. But there is something here that is kind of hard to not reconcile with in some form or another. And I'll offer one last little association anecdotal thing. I remember the first time I ever saw Slavoj Žižek speak. It was at Pomona College. He gave a lecture, and a very precocious Pomona College undergraduate student asked him a question about Deleuze in relation to like natural oil reserves. And he did his very famous thing about how like, oh, Mother Nature is a very awful thing. In order for something like gasoline to be producible today, we can't make these assumptions about the consistency of the earth. And he said that it was part of a critical response to a Deleuzian framing of a question where capital is already post-Oedipal. So we already have these sort of like flow states. But I do find Jed Wilson's remarks here on talking about Deleuze in relation to time like really fascinating and really, really productive. And I wonder if there's a reply there. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the question of Deleuze in relation to Lacan and to psychoanalysis is a fairly complex one, I think, for several reasons. Some of it's just at the level of pure biography, right? Deleuze collaborates for years with Guattari, who has perhaps an even more complex relation with Lacan, given that he was on Lacan's couch for many years and also in his seminar, and I think was sort of a golden boy of Lacan for a time, and turned enfant terrible, it would seem. He I don't personally see it as a turning away from Lacan, actually, that Guattari effectuates. I think, in fact, sometimes, and this is actually a very Žižekian idea, to be very faithful to someone's work, to the trajectory of their work, you have to kind of betray something at the level of identifications and the strictures that can emerge through the intersubjective living of it. And part of my interest in Deleuze and Guattari, actually, somewhat ironically, comes from an intensification of my interest in the late Lacan, where I see them as not only not in contradistinction to each other, but in fact singing very harmonious tunes. I mean, we'd have to say a lot about why I would put it this way, but I actually think the philosophical foundations of Lacan's work in the 1970s is not the same as the foundations that subtend his work in the 50s and still into the 60s. And where he ends up, for me, is very close to what Deleuze and Guattari are doing, even when they might have still been bad-mouthing each other. You can even find moments in Guattari where he's like annoyed with Lacan's use of topology and everything. And I think I understand that as both having a truth based on certain concerns he has about how that was creating, potentially in the minds of Lacan's students, certain reifications. But whatever Guattari thought about it, I think the resonances are very strong. Yeah. Now, the other reason to speak of Deleuze and Guattari in this particular context is that I think theirs is a philosophical world that's quite sensitive to questions of temporality. I mean, I don't think every philosopher equally treats this problem. I mean, it's just every philosopher has their particular sensibilities and the things they're more oriented around than other issues. And they just happen to be people who thought a lot about time. And that's partially where I end up tilling this soil. I mentioned a couple things in Deleuze, but like in Pelbart's book, I mean, it's quite a expansive taxonomy of, temporal possibilities in Deleuze's work and in Guattari's as well. I didn't even touch on the ways in A Thousand Plateaus and in the work on the smooth and the striated, for instance. These are concepts that have enormous impact on my reading of temporalities in the clinic, for instance. So that's partially why to bring in Deleuze and Guattari here. Yeah, and I think a lot of the bad blood is a combination of historical and biographical residues, identifications to groups, and often enough, either not reading your opponent or reading your opponent without a lot of good faith curiosity. Could that be said? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I wonder, and I'll get off the floor after this second line of social. What do you think about? I mean, because there's a very Deleuze does not like the sort of Heideggerian approach to um, ontological impossibilities. I mean, he's and she views that as like directly the object cause of Heidegger's right wing turn.
Mm.
But I wonder if there's something in there about. I mean, how do we quote that back together with the Freudian point about the real in relation to time and impossibility? If the unconscious doesn't recognize time, um,
Yeah.
then you need a different version of like thinking about how time works in the clinic. And I think that the way that I've heard you and also Benoit and Denise Ciamarella, who's not here, talk about time in relation to impossibility, the fourth dimension, these all of these like repetitions start to come back together here in
Mm.
interesting ways where we're not dealing with we're not dealing with chronological time. We're dealing with a different kind of time here.
Yeah.
Anyways, thank you.
Thank you. Very rich questions and associations. I'm not sure I could make an intelligent or authoritative response to your last inquiry here. The things that jumped out were uh, maybe we have to. I mean, I guess it touches on when you mention impossibility in relation to Deleuze, it touches on a problem that's kind of irked me sometimes is how to think the negative in a Deleuzian register. And it's something that I don't know. I think we have to work at. There's a way of reading like difference and repetition, for instance, where his, shall we say, allergic reaction to a certain kind of German idealist structuration of everything around negation seems to produce, for me, occasionally, a symptomatic impossibility of negation in the form of, this pure field of affirmations, this all the way down. I tinker with this a lot and don't know always how to get out of the trap that it might represent. But a step forward in this for me came from engaging with the object-oriented ontology people, one of whom I mentioned here, which was Timothy Morton, but kind of the more uh, foundational figure is Graham Harman. And I think when I understood Harman to be saying, in a way, the Kantian move of placing this placing the object, the thing in itself, in this place of unreachability, it's not wrong, it's incomplete. He's saying it's yes, but it's every object in every relation to every other object that has this problem of you can never capture what is outside in any representational system or what have you. That helped me move somewhere else. And on the strength of that, I started to think of we're still in a unbroken, we can stay in this unbroken field of the real, but from every vantage point, from every point of view, we're going to have limits. We're going to have a grappling with the negative. Yeah. but this doesn't reduce the negative to a particular human condition or a condition of language, right? It just becomes part and parcel of being a part of this weird thing we're doing, which is being sentient in the universe, right? Does that get us anywhere? Am I saying anything of consequence? Okay. Anyway.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jed.
Thank you, Seth. Yes. Anybody else have ideas about time? No. Or if any clinical vignettes come to mind, or I mean, something you'd feel comfortable sharing, observations of that kind. Or what is your experience of time in this contemporary moment? How do you grapple with permacrisis? Or what are your mutant resistant temporalities? If you feel like sharing.
Jed, we have a question on the chat. Would you mind? Would you like to read the question and
Yeah, let me look. Sure. The future does not have a future for everyone. Those who espouse apocalyptic beliefs expect and can't wait to experience the end of times and final judgment. To what extent such worldviews impede any efforts for securing a viable future where we can inhabit future together? Should we be worried? Yeah, this is an important addition to my discussion, which in a way starts from a presupposition of working with a kind of secularized time, wherein the presumption I'm starting from is that while there certainly are people of this kind who have these profound convictions about the end times and about the future, I don't see it as hegemonic and as total and as structuring of all of society as it was in the pre-modern era. However, I think your question can't be just dismissed, because even though we are in this postmodern or post-postmodern space we are in, we do indeed see the return with a vengeance, so to speak, of these kind of pre-modern maps of reality. They're always, and this is the funny thing about when you try to recapitulate the old, they're never, exact replicas, right? Like they're newfangled reconstructions of what it might have been like to think the world in the 14th century or something. But they do indeed have some of this certainty about an afterlife, about a process of apocalyptic destruction that is ultimately for the good and in God's hands, and etc., that I think have really dangerous implications for our contemporary moment, because of how, especially right now, I mean, the United States is a good example where this kind of worldview is not too far from the seat of power, right? I doubt Trump gives a shit at all about afterlife or has ever thought about it once, but that's not him. But there's this machine around him where I think there are fervent believers of this kind, and he knows where his bread is buttered, and so he's got to pay homage to this. And And so it does have a real force, and then you end up with yeah, something different than would be depicted in Melancholia, for instance. We'd have to construct a kind of uh, a new Justine who is a fervent believer, right? It's the person who's excited for the for the collision, but for a totally different reason than Justine is excited for it, right? Because she's delighting in annihilation. But this is somebody who welcomes it for the reasons that you've suggested here. It might bring about some better virtual world in heaven for them and the like. So I haven't really advanced much from what you've provoked here. You're just rightfully complicating the picture. So thank you. We have to take this into account. Thanks for your note here, Seth, about Justine. Yeah. A bit of a provocation where I decide that this was von Trier's symptomatic moment, but you know, why not? I say it with love. I think it's an incredible film, but we all have our symptomatic moments that creep into our creative acts, so no problem. I could be wrong too. Yeah. Since Manolis has given us this excellent question on religion, something I cut from the text comes from a different religious uh, lens, and I think you might find it interesting as a contrast. It's something I discovered in the Pali Canon of Buddhism in the earliest scriptures, where a king comes to the Buddha and they sort of exchange pleasantries, how you doing type of stuff, you know, and the king, it turns out, is doing his kingly stuff, you know, I'm conquering and controlling and whatever. And it's really great because the Buddha wastes no time to just drop the anvil. He confronts this poor king with melancholia, with the rogue planet. He says, "Let me ask you, king, what if somebody came from the east and somebody you knew to be trustworthy and they said to you, King, I've just come from the east and I see this great mountain rolling in and it's destroying all life in its wake. Can't be stopped, you know." And then you had somebody come from the west and they say the same thing. There's a mountain rolling in from the west and it's destroying all life in its wake. What will you do, great king? And then, as you probably are anticipating, there's one coming from the north and there's one coming from the south. So he poses this question, what would you do, great king? And the king says something like, and this is where the king reveals himself to be kind of hip. He's not such a dummy, you know, and it sounds like he's probably a great Buddhist here too, because he says, what else could be done but follow the Dharma, do good, do meritorious deeds. You know, it's a fascinating response because it's this sort of ultimate point of being asked, what would you do if the act would have to be undertaken with no certainty of a reverberation, of a future at all? If you're just robbed of all futurity as such. And here we have no recourse to heaven exactly. I know we've got this big cycle of rebirth in this tradition, but it's this ultimate point. It's kind of like an inversion of Nietzsche's eternal return in a way. It's like, it's not what would you do such that you would will it to be, you know, forever returning. It's, you know, what would you do if there's no return of anything? You know, what is that act? I don't think we can answer it, at least I can't answer it in this uh, through a recourse to a ready-made system of knowledge like this king is suggesting, right? It's going to have to be a singular answer, yeah. But it's still something maybe profound to take up. So a different religious spin. I think in a way this is what the Alexander Jordan in a secular way is asking themselves. It's, what is the act that I avow from a place of radical precarity with regard to what is to come. The act itself has to begin to stand on its own in a way that it didn't have to before, when they had this workable solution of I'll live each day as if it's my first, where there was still this implied future. That's what's been robbed, what they've been robbed of. And so they have to construct a different temporal atmosphere. The relation to the act has to be radically reworked, for totally political contingent reasons, by the way. Here, I think the most disastrous thing we could do is listen to something like this in the mode of, yeah, so how is this like mommy and daddy, and what is there's a real disastrous, in my view, and unethical engagement with a case like this, which would want to domesticate this whole business into an Oedipal theater. These are real events, real forces. I say real with all the big R, the little r, the medium R. I mean, one has to contend with these things now. I'm not saying that they don't bring their own particular set of sensibilities from the childhood experience, and I'm not saying that hasn't played a role in the analysis. It totally has, but I think you see my point, that this danger of wanting to take this subjective response to the timeless time of perpetual urgency and domesticate it into this eternal childhood of the Oedipal theater would be a real missed opportunity, and potentially an unethical response, in my view.
Thank you, Jed. We have time for another question or two other questions. Someone would like to open the mic?
Seth had another inspiration.
Oh, yes, Seth, please.
I don't want to take up too much space here, but I was thinking about virtual reality in relation to this, because you talked about this sort of cybernetics of some of this in relation to the future and the past, and I wonder, and you mentioned in the case of your analysis something about the museological as well, and I remember back during the pandemic when statues were being toppled left and right, there was a lot of sort of cynical responses to this, where, especially in like mainstream news media in the United States, you had sort of center, mildly left political pundits talking about this as like cynical gestures of tearing down the past, or like, and there was an article that was published in Jacobin from a Marxist historian who was talking about how, like, no, the real cynicism is here in the criticism of this, of like denying something that's happening. And there were countless sort of essays on this, and there was a really interesting one where somebody talked about how many of these statues were also they're not even that old. Like, statues that are celebrating Confederate war generals as some sort of like apologia to the history of slavery in the United States. And
They're
like
from like
I
1995 or something.
right, yeah. And
Yeah, yeah.
it's interesting because it sort of points to this thing about how like if we're going to talk about changing the past or changing the future in relation to this sort of virtual overlay of how we understand the symbolic envelope of social life, like it's already happened, like we've already demonstrated that we can change the past in some sort of in some very real kind of interesting ways. And I wonder, you know, how you're seeing some of that play out in your clinical practice or in some of your research on these topics.
Yeah, I mean, here I think a good dose of old-fashioned Freudianism would kind of help everybody, because I think Freud already destabilizes a, a kind of naive historical idea from the gate, right? I mean, with Freud, it's very audible in the early, 1900s kind of mode, but it's everywhere really, is that with troglodyte and screen memories and everything else, like there's no history anywhere that stands in some um, pure space of the truth of what actually happened or something. I mean, it's like your statue example is a great kind of concrete analog of what sort of happens in the clinic when somebody is thinking about their history. They're already shaping a kind of contemporary statue of the old statue. And I think this is neurologically uh, pretty well understood at this point, is that memories are creations. They're always being generated anew. There's no, you know, scroll or tape in the brain from which one goes to which one goes back and grabs hold of what one can. This is completely a fiction that we lived with for most of history, right? So in a way, I kind of see it as just an intensification of this this radical point that's already at the origins of psychoanalysis. It's just that even if we're analysts, we can fall prey to this other naivete about history, because this is part of our makeup, right? So we have to kind of watch this, especially taking care that it doesn't bleed into our kind of technical um, stance, like how we conduct the treatment. Um, so yeah, I think the virtualities of the future, which we are constructing in this way of resistance, are also in some relation to a reconstructing of history, um, which is already what it is to do history. But to avow that in the clinical operation, to recognize that when one is, quote, historicizing, one is actually um, already uh, in motion, already in an act of becoming and creation. Um, yeah, I mean, this is probably where we have to read Freud against Freud, because there's a thing in Freud also of what actually happened and when it actually happened. I mean, the magisterial example of this is his chronologies in like the Wolfman case. It's just you just see him tearing his hair out over like the intricacies of, well, it had to have happened with, in this month and not that month. And you see why he wants to get there. Like there's a real laudable desire to understand how troglodyte was functioning in a chronology. he's not a dupe. Like, he's not just trying to be at some level of what happened and therefore we know who the subject is. It's not that. But I do think in this zest he has for trying to construct this airtight historicization, he sometimes slips, into a certain credulousness around these things. It's brief, but it's important to take care with. I think we have to like really go in for the more radical implications of his own historical methodology, if that makes sense. And it could have great political ramifications for us too, I believe.
Well, thank you so much, Jed. Thank you so much for this very stimulating IIP Talks. It's time for us to land. Who wants to get in touch with us to ask any kind of questions about the IIP in general, about our formations? Will be very welcome. We'll be very glad to answer. Jed, thank you so much, and thank you everyone to be here. I would have many questions, probably other people also, Jed.
If you have questions or you want to talk more about it, I'll put my this is my email address in the chat. You can always email me if you want. I like to chat with whomever wants to talk about these things, so feel free.
Jed, thank you so much for this precious work that you shared with us once again. And thank you, everyone. Have a nice weekend and see you soon. See you very soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.